Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing, in my opinion, one of the most intriguing, probably the best matchup, one of the best matchups that we're going to see in week 4. It's going to be Arkansas traveling to Auburn in what I think is going to be a very explosive game. It's going to be intense, it's going to be hard hitting. And I think it's going to be one of those games where I would argue it's going to be what I call a bowl elimination game, where you do need 6 wins to make a bowl game. But I do think when we talk about Arkansas and Auburn 3-4 months from now, when they're at that between the 5 to 7 game win mark, this could be the deciding game between them getting into a bowl game versus not getting into a bowl game. Now, with that said, we'll discuss Arkansas first because they're the visiting team. Arkansas versus Oklahoma State 2 weeks ago had 648 yards of offense and managed to lose that game. They've been explosive. Taylor Green has done everything that he can to try to find the right reads. Bob Petrino has managed to extensively open up the playbook way more than what we ever saw last year. And I think this game, a lot of what this Arkansas game is really going to come down to from an Arkansas perspective is, yes, you do have, I think you'd really do like to see more of a complementary style of football too, because Taylor Green can also run the ball. And the thing with Arkansas too is, for the most part, they've had been able to have some really quality looks too. You do get nervous about Arkansas to some degree because, in my opinion, we talked about this earlier into the season, where if Arkansas really does struggle at the beginning of the year, and if they do decide to let go of Sam Pittman at any point, which I'm not saying they should, I'm not saying they would, I'm not saying they will, because I really do think that Sam Pittman is a great coach, a great guy, and somebody who I think would be great on any staff in college football. But let's face it, we have seen some significant improvement from this team. I think the one thing that Arkansas was criticized a lot for last year was their offensive line. And I think between having Bobby Petrino there to kind of oversee the offense, and maybe Sam Pittman having enough time to be able to oversee all of the game, and particularly maybe spending some extra time on the offensive line, I think the protection has gotten significantly better since last season. Now, I think on the flip side of that, I do think to some degree UAB was able to fluster Taylor Green a little bit. I think they were able to get him in some pretty favorable matchups where Arkansas really couldn't run away with that game until late third quarter, early fourth quarter, to the extent that UAB also had about 300 yards of offense against them too, which going into a game which should be considered a sort of a softy sort of game, I do think it opens up the floodgates for Auburn to be able to exploit that to some degree. Because when you were watch Taylor Green against Oklahoma State, a lot of that momentum was really because they were able to make adjustments, and they were able to do everything they can. But ultimately, this game is really going to come down to two things, regardless of whether you're rooting for Arkansas or Auburn. It's going to come down to number one, who's going to have the most explosive plays on offense, because I really doubt there's going to be any sort of defense in this game whatsoever. I expect a high scoring shootout sort of game where we're going to see explosive plays all over the field, not only passing but rushing too. And I think also, most importantly, this game is going to come down to who's going to make less mistakes. I talked about this in my preview in Arkansas 3 months ago. Arkansas and Sam Pittman, they do not know how to win close games whatsoever. They have Nebraska syndrome, where anytime they have a close game, they just, for whatever reason, just cannot get it done. And to me, this is one of those games where if you're looking at 2024 through a full lens, and Arkansas sitting there between 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 7 wins, and you're wondering whether to extend Sam Pittman or not and give him another season. These are the games that we're going to be discussing. We're going to be discussing the Oklahoma State loss. We'd be discussing if they blew another close game versus Auburn. Those are the games that are ultimately the difference between being a winning coach in college football versus being a losing coach in college football and being a coordinator or a position coach somewhere. I mean, granted, there are going to be, there are definitely some concerns with both of them. I mentioned from Arkansas's perspective, I mentioned, Taylor Green's been explosive, but UAB has shown some ways to be able to pressure him. And they do have a gauntlet of a schedule coming up, as well as Auburn too, which now I'm about to transition to. But for Auburn, here are the programs that you have for your next four. So after Auburn, so after Arkansas, you have Oklahoma, Georgia, Mizzou, and Kentucky. Now for a freshman starting quarterback who played his debut last week versus New Mexico, I thought Hank Brown looked pretty solid. I mean, he looked comfortable. He was making the correct reads. He was relying on his receivers to make some yards after catches, and for him to be in there and really look comfortable, it in my opinion, for an Auburn team who doesn't have as much talent as you saw the past couple years, and Hugh Freeze really relying on a lot of those younger playmakers that he couldn't immediately fulfill in the NIL. I think it really says a lot that how much smoother Auburn's offense looked with Hank Brown in there compared to week one when you were talking about UCal or any of those games at the beginning too. Yes, they did play. I think Alabama A&M was the other game, but I don't. You got to take that game with a grain of salt. So for Hugh Freeze to pull the plug on Payne Thorne that early, I thought was pretty telling too, especially when in my preview of them last week, one of the big criticisms that Hugh Freeze had was not going after a NIL transfer quarterback and inserting him in right there, because to me the only way you don't do that is if you believe that Payne Thorne's the guy, or for whatever reason you trust this freshman quarterback in Hank Brown, which from what I've seen, I think you have to roll with him, even though you do get concerned about these games next week. But at the same time, this will be easily the biggest game of his life. And when I think of this Auburn team, you know, I mentioned this a couple seconds ago, but this really needs to be a mistake free game as humanly possible. And if I'm Auburn, I really think you need Hank Brown to rely on his eyes, trust what he's seeing. He's gonna have to hope that Arkansas either blows some assignments or blows some coverages in a way where maybe he can get some big explosive plays at the beginning of the game, whereas going into the third quarter or the fourth quarter, he's really comfortable and kind of on a roll where he can settle down a little bit too. And I do think it makes a huge difference that they're home too. So I do think it takes a little bit of less pressure off Auburn too. That he's gonna have that home crowd. He has all the momentum on his side, because I would have to agree that for the most part, I think fans were ready to see Hank Brown starting over Payton Thorne. So you have that going for you. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of pressure on this Auburn backfield to help out Hank Brown, at least initially at the starting of the game. So at the same time, your Arkansas has really struggled to get any sort of pass rush whatsoever, even looking into the past couple weeks. I mean, if Hank Brown can trust his eyes and he does what we saw versus last week versus New Mexico, which is be efficient. He had 285 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. So everything is there for him to possibly pull off the what I would probably argue is going to be an upset, because in my opinion, Arkansas is definitely a more talented football team. They have a more experienced coaching staff, and yes, we've seen what Hugh Freeze offenses look like, but I think this game will really be a testament in terms of how they're going to look the rest of the season too. We saw glimpses of what it could look like in New Mexico, but for it to be translated onto a bigger stage versus a team like Arkansas is going to be truly telling as well. Because at the same time too, the one thing I will add in terms of this Arkansas Auburn matchup is, statistically speaking, Arkansas has been number one in the country on third down. And I talked about before the explosive plays and the lack of mistakes, but if you're Auburn, you need to really find a way to put Taylon Green in uncomfortable situations where he's going to have to make big explosive plays on third downs, third and tens, third and nines, third and unmanageables. Those Because when you put him in a situation like a third and three or a third and five, he's going to be able to find that quick read to the outside and get a couple yards, or he trusts more of a read option where he can use his legs and he can use his athleticism to get the first down as well. So ultimately, both these teams they're going to throw the ball well. I anticipate both these quarterbacks at least having 300 yards over the air more than likely. And you definitely have to you have to win the turnover battle and make less mistakes. But also, I think if you're Arkansas, you need to be able to control the tempo of the game as much as you can, because I think, yes, you do need to try to find that balance of getting your rushing attack involved as much as you can. But at the same time, I think this could be one of those games where it comes down to who has the ball last on that final drive. Because if Arkansas does lose this game in the final moments, or there is another coaching error or something to that extent, it's just going to shine more eyes on this Arkansas program in terms of Bobby Petrino possibly taking over for Sam Pittman, or it's just going to call into question, is Sam Pittman the long term guy leading to this program? So in my opinion, when I look into this game, I believe it's going to be probably, I'm looking at least north of 30 points, at least probably north of 500 plus offense combined with both of these teams. I'm anticipating probably a 37-34, or maybe 34-31, somewhere in that realm. But I think Arkansas definitely needs this game more than Auburn, because Hugh Freeze, he's going to his second year. He didn't have as good of a NIL class or recruiting class he would like, and Arkansas at this point probably has more talent than Auburn. So to me, this game is definitely going to be telling in terms of what both of the trajectories of these programs are going to look like, and to what extent who can play more disciplined, who can make less mistakes.